Welcome back to the Autism ADHD podcast, Casey Waugh.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be back. I honestly don't remember. Was it like a year ago?
I think it was.
Yeah.
And I am thrilled that you are back. You are such a lovely powerhouse of knowledge.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
So today we're going to talk about something that comes up often, and that is picky eating, right? I hear this from parents all the time that come in, and I am not an OT, right? I am not a nutritionist. I've got sort of the behavior piece of this, and there are lots of pieces to picky eating. So before we get into it, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. So my name is Casey Waugh. I am an OT in Pittsburgh. I've worked in pediatrics since I graduated from school about 10 years ago now. So I've worked in a bunch of different settings. I've done outpatient where I was part of their feeding team. So I was on the team that would do the full evaluations with the speech therapist, myself. We had a nutritionist, a doctor, and we were in a psychologist, and we were all evaluating, like you said, all of the different pieces of feeding and meal times. So that was one of my big roles when I was in outpatient. And then I moved into early intervention, where again, I did a lot of feeding with the little ones. So a lot of issues with transitioning from, a bottle to baby food or baby food to solid foods. And then now I currently am working in a school. So I don't do feeding as much in a school setting because it's just that's not really the place where we work on feeding particularly. But since I work in a school in the summer, I'm off. So this summer I have been doing some private feeding sessions in people's homes for older kids. So that has been, feeding is just something that I find very fascinating. It is very complex, but it's really such an essential part of our day, every day. It's such a stressful but important part. So I really enjoy working with families and kids to figure out how to best get kids eating. And
yes, like you said, it's an everyday thing. Yeah, it's not something that just comes up every once in a while, right? No. I mean, eating is every day. We have to do it. And when it comes to eating in kids with ADHD and or autism, it's different. I mean, it's different than your regular sort of picky eating that may come up developmentally, naturally before kind of kids are around 6 or 7. And then you're looking at a massive differences there. If we see that there are differences after that, we know something else is happening. But for kids, especially kids on the spectrum, we see really big differences, very big feelings about eating. And food can be a challenge and almost a battleground, which is hard for obviously the child first and foremost, and then families, because they just don't know what to do, right? So let's talk about some reasons why we might see picky eating.
Right. Okay. So I guess I'll start just talking about autism in particular, because it is feeding issues in children with autism. Some people will say, like, depending on what researcher you ask, it's up to like 80% of kids with autism have some sort of disordered feeding. Now, I think it's also important to remember that there's kind of a difference between when feeding is like you have a limited amount of foods that you eat, but you're growing, you're gaining weight. Maybe it's not the most nutritional, like as parents, we feel so much like pressure and guilt about feeding our kids the best vegetables and fruits in every variety. And it's just very challenging to do that with any child. But when it comes to children with autism, it's more likely that their diet is more restricted than we would like, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there is a nutritional problem. So we kind of have to make sure that we are including other people in the process of figuring out, is this something that we really need to focus on now and prioritize because there's a nutritional deficit? We're seriously only eating carbs, which happens a lot. We are only eating less than 10 foods. Those are kind of those red flags that, like, yes, this is something we need to address. If we've got 20 to 30 foods that rotate, that we can eat different brands, we can eat different flavors, we have a couple fruits, maybe only one vegetable, if that, these are more, yes, it's stressful and it's disordered, but let's think about, is this really something that is nutritionally causing a deficit? Because I like to differentiate that, because I'm going to go into the reasons why food is so hard for kids with autism. And some of these you may not have thought of before, but the biggest piece that I think is impacting this, that is kind of missing from the conversation, is the motor piece of eating different foods. So we know that foods feel differently in our mouth. We know that people will say, oh, it's a texture thing. That's kind of what we always hear or think. They don't like this texture. They don't like the feeling of meat. And that very well may be true. But a lot of times the sensory issues are secondary to the fact that they don't have the motor or the oral motor skills to actually manage that food in their mouth. We're learning more and more about how connected autism and motor planning is, how we plan out what to do with our muscles, what we do in response to different input. And feeding is it's the only thing that requires every single system in your body to work together, including those muscles. So when I see kids who are not eating any meat, any raw fruits, or any raw vegetables, my first question is about oral motor skills. Do we have the strength? Do we have the ability to rotate our jaw and actually grind food up? This is something that is like more common than you might think. And then it leads into behavioral refusals of food because they can't manage it. They don't want to deal with that. They're going to stick with the foods that they know. And then we get into this cycle of, I only eat the green Pringles because I know that the green Pringles are safe. So we start out with motor issues. Then it becomes more of a safety thing. Then it's like, okay, we will not expand out of this. So now I'm kind of going on a tangent. So maybe I'm not making sense, but motor skills are a really big piece of feeding, especially with children with autism.
Actually, yeah, I love that you brought that up, because you're so right. That often does not come up when we're talking about food, and it's a huge piece. I mean, imagine not being able to chew something. I mean, that's frightening. You also said the word safe, and I think that's so important. When I am conducting an evaluation for autism as a psychologist, I will often hear issues that are coming up with food. I had recently done an evaluation where the person described foods as safe or not safe for them. And you brought up the word safe. And I think that's so important. When you think about swallowing, you think about chewing, that would feel very unsafe if you didn't have the motor skills or, the motor ability to chew something so you can swallow it. I mean, there would be a safety issue also with choking. Right. And then, like you said, it kind of rolls into sensory stuff. And then, you have upset parents because the child's not eating certain foods, and they're stressed because their child's not getting nutrients they think, that they need. And it becomes a really big issue. So thank you so much for bringing that up, because it really is an issue of safety.
Right. And I think it's going off of that too, that, we may think as parents, like, this isn't that big a deal. You ate these chicken nuggets yesterday. Why aren't we eating them today? And that, food, we can't control what food goes into our kids' mouths. Like, as parents, we want to control sleeping, eating, and going to the bathroom. And we have no control over any of those things in our kids. And they're what cause us the most stress in our lives. But when it comes to the food, like, if it doesn't look exactly the right way, or it may not, that day they just don't have enough bandwidth to tolerate that, it can be really frustrating, because for us as an outsider, we don't necessarily understand what it feels like. But as a parent, you know, this is very real for them. It might feel like pain. It might feel like the heat, you know, you're like, this is room temperature, and they're saying this is scalding hot. Like, that is not an exaggeration. You know, there are differences in how sensory information is processed in the brain, and we have to respect that this is like a very real feeling that is happening in their mouth, in their body. And that doesn't mean that we just accept that and don't like try to work through it, but we really have to make sure that we are respecting that what they're feeling is real and valid. And, you know, it might seem extreme or silly in the moment. Like, again, going back to temperature is something that comes up a lot. Like, if it is, or other kids, I've had kids who need it directly out of the oven, and they will like pick it up off of the pan and put it in their mouth. And you're like, oh my gosh, like you're going to burn the roof of your mouth. But just the ability to recognize and differentiate between the sensory system can be impaired. And we know that, and that impacts feeding a ton. So just recognizing it is real. It's frustrating, but it is real. And we have to be careful of the words that we say when a child says like, that's too hot, and you touch it and it feels like an ice cube, you know? So
I'm glad that you brought that up, that it is real, because if it was easy, they would just eat it. Right. It's way better than arguing with us parents about it. Right. So, you know, absolutely believe them. And when we're talking about sensory differences, sometimes it's hard to explain for children on this spectrum specifically. So, you know, a child may not communicate their discomfort with food in a way that maybe a neurotypical parent would expect. Right. So they may not say, oh, you know, this is different for me today. You know, I'm exhausted. I'm overwhelmed. I know I ate it yesterday. I hear you. I don't have enough spoons today, if you want to go with the spoon theory. Right. But it's not what you're usually going to hear. Or, you know, Mom, I know this is frustrating for you. I get it. I know you wish I could eat more things, but it feels like this in my body and in my brain and in my mouth, and I can't tolerate it. So here we are, more likely to see challenging behavior, like no, or pushing it away, spitting it out, not coming to the table, those types of things. But that doesn't necessarily mean that, oh, they're just giving me a hard time, or, you know, they don't feel like eating, or they are upset about whatever. It could really have to do with the way it's presented, the way the temperature, the feeling, the motor movement, like you said, the chewing. There's so much happening. So looking at it always with curiosity, instead of my child's driving me crazy, right? Which may pop up in your brain. Now, I'm not saying it hasn't popped up in mine first thing, my default setting, right? But then don't say it, just think through it. When I am consulting with a parent and we've looked into the motor parts, now that's not I'm not trained in that. So that's your wheelhouse, right? So when other people that are trained in, you know, motor movements, swallowing, those types of things are looking at foods, nutritionists, we're looking at, you know, making sure there's no nutritional deficits with this child. We're also, again, looking at that behavior piece. And how I've had to describe it is, no wonder they're having a giant reaction. This is a plate of garbage, flaming garbage that you try to serve them. And so when someone puts a flaming plate of garbage in front of you, are you going to happily eat that? The answer is going to be no. Right? I know that sounds like an extreme example, but I want to provide the information of why we're seeing such big responses.
Right. I think that it's very easy as parents for us to assume that this is a choice, is, that this is, I'm choosing to be difficult, or I'm, looking at it solely from the behavioral side of it, because that's what we see. We outwardly see, like you're saying, leaving the table, throwing the food on the floor, pushing it away, taking one bite and leaving and saying that you're full. But from an OT perspective, what I like to keep reminding myself is the food that is presented, if they're having a hard time eating it, it's either not meeting their motor needs or their sensory needs at that time. And that, I think we also can very easily, when we are consistently met with foods that we don't have the skills for, then it does turn into just that initial like anxiety about it. I'm not even going to try this. They just are in that state of fight or flight before the food's even presented. And then also, this is such a hard thing, because we can also inadvertently get
all the above.
Yes, can get our kids into a spot where we accidentally like limit their food even more. If, let's say, the mac and cheese has to be this specific, like it has to look this very specific texture. So then we present it and we get pushback from that. So then as a mom, we make another box. We present it again. That doesn't look right. Okay, fine, I'll make another one. So then we are kind of reinforcing that first presentation is not okay. So we're going to do it again. And then we're going to do it again, which in the moment, we're like, we need to eat. Like, I don't blame parents for doing that, but then we reinforce this cycle that food's not okay. So we have to do it again, and then we have to do it again until it's just perfectly right. And then we'll eat it. So we can kind of just inadvertently limit the variety too. And then let's say, we used to eat SpongeBob mac and cheese. Now we only eat the tube shaped ones. And then when we present the SpongeBob again, they don't eat it. So we never bring it back out again. Because we're like, don't want to rock the boat too much. Everybody's walking on eggshells. And it just becomes, again, a stressful cycle that happens 3 times every single day. And that's
exactly.
They're coming to your office. They're looking for OT help. And unfortunately, the older we get, it's just things get entrenched. I mean, we know as adults, it's hard to change our habits. When you have a child who doesn't have the internal motivation to change those habits, when it comes to food, it makes it very challenging. So I feel you. Like, I'm not saying that this is anybody's fault. It's not, we just we're living in survival mode. Both sides, parents and kids, are doing what they think is going to help them survive that moment. And it can kind of create the perfect storm.
You describe that so perfectly, because we are very much getting through the next moment, right? Like I can say that as a parent of 2 differently wired kids and a psychologist. So, we really do need to give ourselves a little bit of a break. Mm-hmm. And then, really work on also our child communicating what's happening and giving them the space. Now, again, if they are in fight, flight, freeze, like you were saying earlier, it's hard. It's hard to talk when you're feeling that way. It's almost impossible. But if we can help with that self-awareness and describing what's happening, oh, that looks like this. To me, it looks like it was cooked this way or in this oil, or, mm-hmm. It's amazing what kids will pick up that mm-hmm. will tell me. And it's like, wow, okay, so maybe I wouldn't have noticed that, but you certainly did. And that doesn't mm-hmm. make it where it's not important. It is important.
Right.
And again, helping them talk through that and see, how they can understand and explain it in a way where we're not in a total meltdown, mm-hmm. When we're having that discussion, because like you said, this is daily.
Yes. Yeah. And I think too, sometimes, when you have kiddos who are very brand specific, like they only eat the chips that are in this bag, and then like the company changes the bag and we no longer eat the chips. We have to sometimes, as if we're thinking like, oh, this isn't that big of a deal, I'll just get the different brand, or I'll just put, I don't have butter, so I'm going to use margarine or something like that, in and of itself can make this considered like a new food for this kid, because in their mind, it may be that whole picture is one food. Milk is only in the blue cup. We only drink milk out of the blue cup, because in their mind, milk is blue cup with white liquid inside. It's not the actual milk inside. So that those tiny shifts can also be confounding to us. Like, what the heck? It's the same thing, but in their mind, it's not. Stick pretzels and twisty pretzels are two different foods. So just, I think that it's a shift in mindset. And again, giving ourselves grace, but giving our kids grace too, and recognizing that it's deeper than them just like not wanting to try it, or trying to push my buttons, or that kind of thing, or they don't like my cooking kind of thing. So it's so challenging. Outside of just that texture piece, there's all those other things that kind of can play into it. I think I've talked a lot about autism because it is very common. And I think, considering that there's also, ADHD side of it, I would say that kids who are picky eaters who have ADHD, it's more like not necessarily related to that diagnosis. It can totally happen, because we know that any kid can be a picky eater. So kids with ADHD can also be picky eaters, but I would say it's much more prevalent and directly related to the differences in the brain, because autism and ADHD affect different parts of the brain. It's more common in the kids with autism.
Definitely. I see that too in my practice. So really, understanding where the child might be coming from, even though maybe we haven't had that. And also, I think recognizing where we personally come from as parents and professionals. Now, growing up in the olden days, in my house, we had to all sit together at a certain time. You're going to eat it, whether you want to eat it or not. And you don't get up until it's now my dad might be listening to this. Yeah. It's true, Dad. It's true. So that's it. Like you are staying there until you clean all of that off your plate into your mouth, because you can't give it to your sister.
Yes.
Either. Right. Oh, yeah. So that, I think a lot of our experiences and what we think should, there's the should, right? What we think should happen is a part of this too. And then, we also, a lot of people our age that are parents have heard, well, people are starving in other countries. You're going to sit here and eat it. And so you're here, you have this and it shapes you, right? I mean, to everybody to a different extent, but when you notice those shoulds and those expectations that we're bringing to the table, they may not fit our child, or, maybe they didn't really fit us either. We just didn't get the acknowledgement that it may not fit us.
Right. Exactly. I think that is very common, especially when parents are trying to kind of break away from that. And there might be grandparents who are, not respecting that choice, or saying like, you're making it worse. So you have like shame from grandparents or other people in the family. You might have parents who have differing opinions on how to approach this. I mean, that happens in our house. I'm an OT, and my son is pretty picky, and he is of the opinion of trying to do, you have to try it. You have to take this many bites. And I'll say like, I don't think that that's the best approach, and we talk about it, but we still like have different ways that we approach my son's meal times. And that can be a point of contention too, when you have parents who have different ideas about how this is going to go. But I think what you said is essential to that that our children who are neurodivergent, their brains are wired differently, and approaches that may work for some children may not work for them. And I think that the idea that you have to sit down and eat everything on your plate also just kind of teaches our kids not to listen to what their body is telling them. And again, saying like what you're feeling isn't real, isn't valid, so it doesn't matter, you're going to eat it anyways. Another thing I guess I didn't bring up at the beginning, often with children with autism, there's also some issues with interoception, which is that inner feeling of what your body actually does feel like. And sometimes children don't know when they are hungry or when they are full. They might not know that it's time to eat, and they don't have any drive to eat. They may not, be able to fully recognize like, yeah, I haven't eaten more than 3 goldfish all day. I should be eating a meal, until it's like the point of no return, and then you're super hangry and you have, so like these things are also all playing into it. And the one piece of advice that I give parents who kind of are of that more old school idea is that playing with food is a wonderful way outside of mealtimes. Like mealtimes are for nutrition. We're not going to like mess too much with that. If they only eat chicken nuggets for dinner, that's okay for now. We're going to do some work outside of mealtimes. We don't want to add more stress onto the dinner plate. So outside of mealtimes, playing with food can be a wonderful way to remove that pressure of actually eating it and just explore it from a sensory perspective. So that's the one thing that even, without any other therapy or any other professionals involved, that's something that you could start now. If you've got a kid who is really resistant to even exploring new foods, do it outside of mealtime. You can even do it away from the table. So we're just learning about the properties of food. And playing with food is okay. That's another one you hear. You sit down, you eat what's on your plate, and you don't play with your food. And that's like, we're moving away from that now, because we have to respect that this is a whole long game process here.
It is a journey.
It is,
for sure.
Very much is a journey.
It is a journey. And I think, and I like that you brought that up as far as a team. Oftentimes when children are really having challenges around food, they need to have their physician on board, and they need to probably see a nutritionist and an OT to look at, those sensory differences and those motor differences. I mean, there's a lot to it. And then there are people like me that come in, and look at the behavior part of that, because it can be so upsetting, around food. And then also, I can help with the communication part of how can we get them to be more self-aware? How can we get them to communicate what's happening for them? How can we do a preference assessment with food? I mean, there's just so many different cool things that we could do to help support them. And, so looking at food again, there are lots of different ways that this could be happening. And to recognize as ourselves as parents that, they're not just trying to give us a hard time, right? Because parents can get worked up. We're already stressed. We're already sort of like running on empty. And, thinking about it that way, when you tell your child, well, there are children starving, and the child says, well, then give them my food.
Right.
Right. And then as parents, I think, that's not the direction we were hoping you were going to go. But yeah, I mean, I guess that makes sense. You don't want it. So there are just so many different ways to look at food. But what's lovely, because it happens every day, we get lots of opportunity to be able to work on it.
Right. Right. Absolutely. And I think that the very biggest thing that you could start today is getting on a schedule and a routine of when food is presented and sticking with it. It's easier said than done. If you've got like a snacker, somebody who eats a couple of goldfish, and then an hour later they're having some Cheez-Its, and an hour later they have applesauce or whatever, it can be really hard to move into a more specific schedule. When they're in school, that tends to lend itself well to that. Unless some classrooms may have food and snacks available in between, but generally you're going to eat breakfast. then you're going to have lunch, and then you're going to have a snack when you come home, or dinner, depending on how early you eat. So if you have a younger child who's not in school yet, or summer, and we don't have that natural structure to the day, mealtime structure is just essential to helping not only keep things more expected, like we know when food is coming, but also to help develop that ability to feel hungry. As kids, if you eat 3 goldfish and that fills you up, your stomach doesn't get the chance to fully expand and then contract. And so kids can tend to actually eat less throughout the day when they snack, because they're not super hungry for meals. As adults, we tend to, like, if we snack, we're still going to eat our lunch and our dinner. But with kids, snackers tend to eat less throughout the day. Or we've got kids who drink milk, like just cups and cups of milk or juice. And so having a very clear structure of when breakfast is, snack, lunch, maybe another snack, dinner, bedtime snack if necessary, not totally needed, but having a decent hour and a half to 2 hours between that, where the only thing you offer is water, then you're going to get onto the pattern of this is when food comes. And if you don't eat it, that's okay. Food will come again in 2 hours, which can also be a really hard thing to get into. So that's usually the first recommendation I give families before we really work on expanding variety or focusing too much on that, is to get on a schedule and eat together as a family as much as possible.
I love that. And you have such a good point, is that differently wired kids tend to sometimes not realize that they're hungry until it's an emergency. Right. And then it is a big emergency. They're starving. Or, they're getting irritable and they don't, recognize, again, this might be hunger. So really looking at it as, again, like a curious scientist, we're looking at it, we're trying to figure out what's happening with the time, when are we more likely to see this irritability? And that may even help structure that a little bit more as far as timing. Also, of course, they might be on medication, like a stimulant, for instance, that may really impact when they eat.
Yes, for sure. If I know some medications will make you kind of suppress your appetite until one point, and it's maybe, if your child doesn't get hungry until after lunch and they're in school and they're not they didn't eat their lunch because they didn't feel hungry, but then at 1:30 they're super hungry. That's also just important as a parent to know. So then maybe that's included in their IEP to say at 1:30 they need to have a snack, because we need to have food and nutrients to learn. So that, that's a really good point, that medication can impact when and how hungry you feel. And the kids may not be able to communicate that and know that, but when we are more aware of having a structure, and then this is going to happen, you can kind of know more likely that at 1:30 we get super hungry, then that's important to communicate with the team as well.
Casey, I could talk to you all day. And I don't mean to go down another rabbit hole, but I do want to mention one thing before we end our chat, is when you had mentioned kind of those sensory experiences around food, something to consider. And sometimes I'll see that kids are not really eating their lunch. And it also not only has to do with, I'm not sure I'm feeling hungry, but also the overwhelm of the environment, whether that's in the cafeteria, whatever that looks like. And it's too much. It's too much to handle. They're really unable to eat in that certain environment. So again, there's just so many variables to consider, and not trying to overwhelm anyone, but just saying these are things that we need to consider around food. It's not as simple as, here's your food, you should eat it.
Right, exactly. The lunchroom, and I feel like lunch, recess, and gym are the most overwhelming times of day. And sometimes those are the only times of day that our kids are if they're in a self-contained classroom, then that's the time that they're out with the general population. And that is the most stressful time of the entire day. And I think if that is your child, then packing the same lunch every day is okay. Give yourself the permission, if they're going to eat peanut butter and jelly for lunch every day, that's okay. Will they eat peanut butter and jelly every day for the rest of their life? Probably not, but maybe. And like, that's okay. That is okay. I think that giving yourself permission to, we want to have a nutritional variety of foods, but realistically, this is long game. We're working in the long term. I would say 10 protein options, 10 fruits or vegetables, and 10 carbs. Like, you have enough variety there to rotate through and have different meals. Is that what everybody else in your family is eating? Maybe not. But we also have to recognize that there's a lot going on in our kids' lives. And if food is giving them the nutrients that they need to grow and gain weight, and it helps them feel safe, then maybe that's not what we prioritize right now. Everybody's going to have different points at time when this needs, like, maybe it is a crisis and we are seriously only eating pretzels and chicken nuggets. Like, that is crisis mode. We cannot survive off of chicken nuggets and pretzels. We need some other form of nutrition. But if you've got, like I said, 10 of each of those groups, maybe it's not crisis mode right now. So give yourself some permission and some grace that food may be hard. Is this the time you want to focus on it? Maybe it is. If not, that's okay too.
I love that. Okay, Casey, as always, I love chatting with you. Thanks so much for coming on to the Autism ADHD podcast. And I know our watchers and listeners are going to want to know more about you. So how can they find out?
Yeah, so my Instagram handle is OT Time with Casey. I have a website at the same name, and my email is on both of those. You can find me on TikTok. I'm on YouTube. I need to get back into making videos for YouTube. They just take more time, to edit and film and all that. And I just, with life right now, that hasn't happened. But OT Time with Casey, you can find me that way.
Well, I will make sure to have all that goodness available in the show notes.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Casey. I'm sure we'll be talking again soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me back.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for joining me today. Don't forget to click that subscribe button so you don't miss any future episodes. If you like this episode, please share it with someone. It may just be what they need to watch today. If you're a parent, I'd love if you came on over and joined our Facebook group, Autism ADHD Group for Parents. If you're a therapist or educator, come on over to our group, Autism ADHD Group for Therapists and Educators. You're going to find those links right down there in the notes. Thanks so much, and I can't wait to see you in the next episode.
All content provided is protected under applicable copyright, patent, trademark, and other proprietary rights. All content is provided for informational and educational purposes only. No content is intended to be a substitute for professional medical or psychological diagnosis, advice, or treatment. Information provided does not create an agreement for service between Holly Blanc Moses Crossvine Clinical Group, the interviewee, Holly Blanc Moses LLC, and the recipient. Consult your physician regarding the applicability of any opinions or recommendations with respect to your symptoms or medical condition or the symptoms or medical condition of your family member. Children or adults who show signs of dangerous behavior toward themselves and/or others should be placed immediately under the care of a qualified professional.